A child pointed to a birthmark on his right foot and said that a cobra had bitten him in that exact spot. He named the place where he had lived, spoke about his previous family, and said that shortly before his death, he had gone into the garden to pick bananas. When his family followed up on these statements, they discovered the story of a young girl who had died from a snakebite only a few kilometers away. The cause of death appeared to match. The place name matched. The incident in the garden resembled the child's account. But when the official death certificate was examined years later, a single problem emerged at the center of the entire case. According to the document, the snake had not bitten the young girl in the place the child had indicated. Located in Sri Lanka's Kurunegala district, Galgamua was a rural settlement surrounded by extensive farmland. On 27th January 1970, a child named Amitha Herath was born there. His mother, maternal grandmother, and aunt would later tell researchers that they had noticed a prominent mark on Amitha's right foot during the first few days after his birth. It was located slightly below the outer side of his ankle. It could, of course, have been an ordinary birthmark. Almost everyone has various marks on their body, and the vast majority have no extraordinary significance. But when Amitha grew older and began to speak, his family started to wonder whether the mark might be connected to another event he described. According to Ian Stevenson, before Amitha had even turned 2, he began saying that he had lived somewhere else. The place he named was Nithalawa, approximately 7 kilometers from where his family lived. Although this would not be a particularly long distance for an adult, it was not necessarily a place that a 2-year-old child would be expected to know through everyday life. Amitha was also reported to have mentioned certain people whom he said belonged to his previous family, and to have compared 2 different houses. His present family's house had a thatched roof. His previous house, he said, had a tiled roof. Details of this kind increasingly attracted the family's attention. But the most striking part of the account was not the roof of the house. Amitha said that in his previous life, he had wanted to prepare lunch for his father and had therefore gone into the garden to pick bananas. At that moment, he said, a cobra had bitten his foot. To show where he had been bitten, he pointed to the birthmark below his right ankle. According to his family, this was not an isolated or random childhood remark. He repeated the same story and drew a direct connection between the mark on his foot and his death. An investigation in the area led to a young girl named Muthumenike, who had lived in Nithalawa. She was reported to have been bitten by a snake in her family's garden in May 1968, approximately 20 months before Amitha's birth, and to have died later. The death certificate examined by Stevenson recorded the cause of death as cobra envenomation. The manner of death described by the child therefore appeared to resemble an event that had actually occurred. At first glance, the case seemed highly impressive. A small child was naming another settlement. He was said to have spoken about a previous family. He claimed that he had gone into a garden to pick bananas and had been bitten by a cobra. Moreover, he had a congenital mark on his foot that he associated with the incident. In a nearby village, a young girl had indeed died after being bitten by a snake. But a case cannot be evaluated solely on the basis of details that appear to be correct. It is equally important to determine when the child made those statements, who first recorded them, whether the 2 families had known each other beforehand, and to what extent the official documents agreed with the account. There was an important connection in the Amitha case that strengthened the possibility of ordinary information transfer. The 2 families were not complete strangers. Amitha's mother had known Muthumenike's older brother, Gunaratne, from their school years. It could not be established with certainty how close this acquaintance had been or whether they had previously discussed Muthumenike's death. Nevertheless, it was clear that at least one channel of communication existed between the 2 families. Nithalawa was only about 7 kilometers away, and in rural communities, it would not have been unusual for a notable death to be discussed in neighboring settlements. It is therefore possible that Amitha learned the story directly from his mother, another relative, a neighbor, or a conversation he overheard without anyone realizing it. People often assume that small children do not understand what is being said around them, yet they can sometimes remember a single word, a place name, or a dramatic event in unexpected ways. They may later combine these fragments with play, imagination, and the reactions of adults. This explanation does not automatically account for every detail in the case. It does, however, show that the claim that the families were entirely unconnected was not accurate. There is also no reliable record showing that a written list of Amitha's statements was prepared before any attempt was made to verify them. This was an issue Ian Stevenson considered especially important in his research. If a child's statements were written down before the first contact between the families, they could later be compared with the person who was identified. But if the statements were compiled only after events had unfolded, the families had met, and witnesses had spoken with one another, it becomes difficult to determine which information originally came from the child. A child may initially have said only, "A snake bit me." Later, after the family found a suitable death case, the other details of the story may have become more specific. Witnesses can reconstruct their memories without consciously lying. Human memory does not work like a camera. Each time we remember an event, we do not simply replay it exactly as it happened. We reconstruct it. New information, other people's accounts, and strong expectations can influence that process. The most important physical feature distinguishing the Amitha case from an ordinary childhood story was the birthmark. Over many years, Stevenson investigated claims involving birthmarks and congenital abnormalities in children who were reported to remember previous lives. In his view, physical marks of this kind could provide a more objective form of evidence than oral accounts based only on witness memory. If a mark had genuinely been present from birth, it must have existed before the child's later statements. If reliable medical records showed that a fatal wound had been located in the same area, the two physical findings could be compared in a measurable way. For this approach to be persuasive, however, the location of the wound and the location of the birthmark had to genuinely correspond. Amitha's mark was on the outer, lower side of his right ankle. The child said that this was where the cobra had bitten him. Years later, some members of Muthumenike's family also recalled that the snake had bitten her below or behind the ankle. This appeared to suggest a similarity between the birthmark and the family's testimony. But the first statement given by Muthumenike's older brother, Gunaratne, did not agree with those accounts. According to Stevenson, during an interview conducted in 1976, Gunaratne said that the snake had bitten his sister on the toes. In later interviews, however, he changed his account and agreed that the bite had been below the ankle. It is not known exactly why he changed his mind. He may have remembered incorrectly during the first interview, he may have corrected his memory after hearing what other family members said, but the opposite is also possible. His first memory may have been accurate, and he may later have adjusted it to match the majority account. At this point, the death certificate became decisive. According to the entry in the document, the cobra bite had been on the sole of the right foot, close to the little toe. This was not the same location as the ankle area where Amitha's birthmark was found. The difference was not merely a matter of a few centimeters, but a clear anatomical distinction. The place indicated by the child was close to the ankle. The place described in the document was underneath the foot, near the little toe. The official document that was expected to provide the strongest evidence in the case therefore began to undermine, rather than support, the connection with the birthmark. If the death certificate was accurate, the location of Muthumenike's bite did not match the location of Amitha's mark. There was also a clear contradiction between the document and the family members' later accounts. In that case, the birthmark may have been entirely ordinary, and the family may have associated it with the death only after the child began telling the snake story. Stevenson did not conceal this problem. He discussed the case in a section dealing with discrepancies between birthmarks and reported wounds. In his view, it was possible that the document itself was incorrect. The death certificate had been completed 18 days after Muthumenike's death. It was suggested that the inquirer into sudden deaths who prepared the document had not taken detailed notes at the scene and may later have recorded the location of the bite from memory. If the official had remembered the location incorrectly, the family's testimony could have been accurate and the document mistaken. This possibility is not entirely unreasonable. Official documents are prepared by human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. The fact that a record is official does not guarantee that every detail it contains is correct. An anatomical error could occur, particularly in a document completed days later when no original notes were available. But this explanation has not itself been proven. It could not be established exactly whether the person who prepared the certificate had taken notes, why he recorded the bite as being near the little toe, or from whom he obtained the information. Moreover, assuming that the document was wrong could lead the researcher into a dangerous form of selectivity. If the document is treated as strong evidence when the cause of death agrees with the child's account, but dismissed as mistaken when the location of the bite does not agree, then the evidence is being evaluated only according to the desired conclusion. A scientific examination must acknowledge both the supporting and the contradictory aspects of a document. In this case, the death certificate strongly supported the conclusion that Muthumenike died from Cobra envenomation, but it did not support a precise match between the wound and the birthmark. Stevenson drew a broader conclusion from the case. He noted that in cases where medical records were available, relying solely on the memories of family witnesses could result in some wounds being placed in locations different from where they had actually been. According to his assessment, the proportion of such cases might have been as high as approximately 12%. In other words, if researchers had not searched for official records, some matches that never truly existed might have been accepted as genuine because of the well-intentioned but changeable memories of witnesses. This warning is important not only for the Amitha case, but for all similar cases. Years later, a family may look at a child's birthmark and remember the deceased person's wound as having been in the same place. This does not mean they are deliberately inventing a story. Memory can adapt to expectations. Particularly after a family begins to believe that a child is their deceased relative, separate details may gradually merge into a single, consistent narrative. The sources also disagree on whether Amitha stated his name from his previous life. Stevenson's summary indicates that the child did not give the previous person's name. By contrast, an article published years later in a local Sri Lankan newspaper claimed that the child had used an expression that could be connected to Muthumenike's name. The source of this contradiction is unknown. The newspaper account may have been influenced by later oral memories. The name may have been mistranslated, or the detail may have been omitted from Stevenson's brief summary. But because no record dated before the verification process is available, it is impossible to determine with certainty which account is correct. A similar problem exists regarding the age at which the child began speaking about the case. Stevenson reported that Amitha began making these statements before the age of 2. The local newspaper article, however, claimed that the first clear statements appeared when he was approximately 3.5 years old. There is a significant difference between a child under 2 and a 3.5-year-old in terms of language development, the ability to absorb information from the environment, and the capacity to construct stories. The age at which the statements began is therefore not a minor detail. The local newspaper account also included additional information about Muthumenike's age, the precise date of her death, traditional treatments, and Amitha's ability to weave mats. Some of these details do not appear in the Stevenson summary available to us. It would therefore be inappropriate to evaluate them with the same level of confidence as the principal evidence. An article published years later may reveal how the case was remembered and retold locally, but it cannot replace original field notes or official records. Do all these contradictions provide a completely ordinary explanation for everything Amitha said? It is difficult to give a definite answer. The acquaintance between the two families, the short geographical distance, and the absence of a written pre-verification record make ordinary information transfer a strong possibility. The child may have heard the story of Muthumenike's death from people around his family. An ordinary birthmark on his right foot may then have been interpreted as the site of a cobra bite because of the story. The attention and questions of adults may also have helped the narrative become more detailed over time. On the other hand, there is no direct record showing exactly where the child obtained the information. The fact that Amitha's mother had known Gunaratne at school does not prove that she told her child about Muthumenike's death. The family's claim that they had never discussed the event may be true. The fact that the child reportedly combined the name Nithalawa, information about a previous family, and a death by cobra bite at a young age is something that supporters of an ordinary explanation must also examine in detail. But the failure to demonstrate one possibility does not prove the other. If the exact route of ordinary information transfer cannot be identified, that does not automatically establish reincarnation. Likewise, if the location of the wound on the death certificate does not match the family's account, that does not mean that everything the child said was meaningless. Rather than choosing one of two extremes, the case requires us to compare how strongly the available evidence supports each explanation. The timing of the birthmark remains one of the noteworthy aspects of the case. 3 family members said that they had seen it during the first few days after Amitha's birth. If their testimony was accurate, the mark existed before the child began telling the Cobra story. In other words, it had not been physically created by adults afterward. But a pre-existing mark on the body can later be connected to a story. The real question is not why the mark happened to be in that particular place, but whether its location corresponded to Muthumenike's actual wound. On this point, the death certificate does not show a precise match. The 2 main possibilities at the center of the case still stand side by side. In the first, the death certificate is correct. Muthumenike was bitten on the sole of her foot, close to the little toe. Over the years, the memories of family members changed and were reconstructed to match the birthmark near Amitha's ankle. Under this interpretation, the physical correspondence disappears, and the possibility that the story was transmitted through ordinary means becomes stronger. In the second possibility, the family member's memory of a wound near the ankle is correct. The official who prepared the document recorded the location of the bite incorrectly 18 days after the death. In that case, the similarity between the birthmark and the wound becomes significant again. However, there is no independent autopsy report, hospital record, photograph of the wound, or medical note prepared at the time of the incident to demonstrate that the document was wrong. There may perhaps be a third possibility. The bite could have left marks on more than one part of the foot. The snake may have first made contact near the ankle, while another mark appeared on the sole. Swelling or treatment procedures may also have caused people to remember the location differently. But the sources contain no reliable information indicating that there were multiple bite marks. If such an explanation is introduced afterwards solely to resolve the contradiction, it cannot be treated as evidence. What makes this case interesting is not so much that it provides an answer, but that it exposes the problem of reliability. On one side, there is a child who was reportedly speaking at a very young age, a congenital mark, and a real death caused by a cobra. On the other, there is a pre-existing connection between the families, the short distance between the villages, the absence of a written record prepared before verification, changing witness statements, and an official document that places the wound somewhere else. Ian Stevenson regarded reincarnation as a serious possibility, yet he also acknowledged that it was impossible to determine with certainty which explanation was correct in the Amitha case. The document could have been wrong. The family's memory could have been wrong. The birthmark could have been unrelated to the event. The case demonstrated why it is dangerous to draw a definite conclusion from a single dramatic correspondence. In a documentary narrative, it is easy to select only the astonishing details. The child pointed to the mark on his foot. A girl who had been bitten by a cobra was found in a nearby village. The place, name, and manner of death were similar. If the story ends at that point, the viewer may be left with the impression that powerful evidence has been presented. But if the anatomical contradiction in the death certificate is omitted, the true structure of the case is distorted. At the same time, it would also be incomplete to explain the entire account solely through the family's acquaintance and dismiss the child's statements as insignificant. The Amitha Herath case may tell us less about reincarnation itself than about how claims concerning the past should be investigated. The child's statements should first be recorded and dated. Researchers should determine whether the families are genuinely independent. Interviews should be conducted separately. The witnesses' first statements should be preserved. Birthmarks should be photographed at an early stage. The locations of wounds should be compared with medical records. Discrepancies should not be concealed. The reliability of a case is revealed not only by the details that appear to be correct, but also by how the details that turn out to be wrong are handled. Today, we do not have a complete, dated record of Amitha's childhood statements. The original image of the death certificate is not available in public sources. No medical photograph or autopsy report showing Muthumenike's wound is known to exist, nor can the full details of the information flow between the two families be established. Because of these limitations, the case cannot be presented as definitive proof. Even so, one scene remains difficult to forget. A small child points to a birthmark on the outer side of his right foot and says that when he once went into a garden to pick bananas, a cobra bit him there. A few kilometers away, a record is found of a young girl who genuinely died from cobra venom, but the official document says that the wound was in another location. Which should be trusted? The document prepared 18 days after the death? The family witnesses speaking years later? Or the statements the child was reported to have made while still very young? Perhaps the document was wrong. Perhaps the witnesses' memories changed. Perhaps the child heard the story of a death from people close to him and began describing it as his own. Or perhaps the explanations available to us today do not account for every detail of the case. The existing sources do not allow us to choose any one of these possibilities with certainty. That may be precisely where the real strength of the Amitha Herath case lies. It does not give us a definite answer. Instead, it leaves us with a more difficult question. If the same document both confirms the manner of death described by a child and undermines the most important connection involving the birthmark, how much of this story should we believe and which parts?